As we move into chapter 3 of White Fragility, it gets harder and harder as we talk about these things. But she's going to talk about what we would consider the modern concepts of racism that she would like us to examine. She gives a quote at the beginning of chapter 3 that says, children today are so open, when the old folks die off, we will finally be free of racism. And I remember thinking that as a teenager, that this is certainly something that will end at some point. And some of the white justices of the Supreme Court came to that conclusion, that there was no reason for us to have a Voting Rights Act, for instance, anymore, that we were done with all of that. Turns out the author would dare to differ with us in those conclusions, and here's what she's going to talk about. It's called New Racism. And let's face it, as long as we live in a fallen world, as long as we are, they say it's just me and thee, and I'm not so sure about thee. That's the way we have to function in this world sometimes, and therefore evil will always raise its ugly head in many ways. So here's what she's asking us to consider. Racism has adapted over time so that modern norms, policies, and practices result in similar racial outcomes as those that we had back in the past in the Jim Crow society, while not appearing, though, to be explicitly racist. And here's what we're calling it, colorblind racism. No one claims today to be racist anymore. But racism, she says, still exists. How is that possible? Well, racism is highly adaptive. It changes over time in different and subtle ways. And so she says today, I want to review the various ways that racism, in her opinion, has adapted over time. Colorblind racism. We pretend not to notice race anymore. We kind of leapt onto the part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech where he said that we would no longer judge somebody by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And that became a buzzword, a buzz phrase for us in the supreme or the dominant society, to use that to say that we are no longer racist. And the background of this has to do, as we came through the civil rights movement, television showed us some of the realities that we had not seen acted out before us. The nation watched in horror as black men, women, and children were attacked by police dogs. They were hit with fire hoses, and they were peacefully protesting, and it shocked our sensibilities. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, and it became much less acceptable for white people to admit to racial prejudice. I think that was why it shocked me so when the white supremacists suddenly came out with their tiki torches and marched through the streets yelling their white supremacist slogans. I didn't think those people existed anymore. I thought all of that was done away with, that they had all died out. Well, the common idea about colorblind racism is, hey, if we don't see race, then racism will end. It's a nice thought. But she says it became, we would stamp people to be racist because they acknowledged race. That doesn't work like that, she says. I don't see race. I don't see you as black. The response the author gives back to us if we say that, and then how will you ever see racism? It's a convenient way for you to ignore the realities that are going on in other people's lives, other people's worlds, in their culture, in their experience. She said, if you're ever going to understand or challenge racism, you'd have to acknowledge that there are white people and black people and brown people in our world. And if we say that we don't see that, then it's kind of pushes it underground. It makes it subconscious. By doing that, she was saying that we who are experiencing white culture and white privilege, and I know you hate that word, but we who live in our supreme or dominant world, we project our reality onto people of color and say, I don't see it, so you shouldn't have it. If we don't see the race of other people, then race goes underground. It goes below the surface. She compares it to the tip of an iceberg. We use color blindness and say, I don't see an iceberg. Well, the rest of it is under the water. It's very much there, but not overtly visible. Under the surface of the massive depth of racist socialization, we have messages, beliefs, images, associations, internalized superiority and entitlement, perceptions, emotions, all of this going on under the surface, and we refuse to acknowledge it. So she says racial bias has become largely unconscious, and there's the deepest challenge, and that's why she named the book White Fragility. The defensiveness that ensues when anyone suggests that we might carry with us racial bias. If you say that to someone, then typically they're going to respond with hurt, with anger, and certainly with defensiveness. And that's why I've taken kind of a passive role in presenting this every week and not responded very strongly to some of the pushback that I've gotten. I have to tell you, I perceive that as defensiveness, and I'm not going to embrace that. I'm not going to engage it in any way. I'm simply going to let that be what you have to deal with, and suggest to you that if this is too hard to listen to, too hard to engage with, then you do have some of that iceberg underneath the water, and you deceive yourself. You're self-deceived. You're not being honest with your true self if you say that that is not there. Some of my discussions that I've had, interesting and enlightening discussions over the last few weeks, has to do with the concept of the golden rule. I'm going to treat you nice, and therefore you must treat me nice. And they say, but you don't live in my world. If you lived in my world, you would see that I'm not treated nice, not by you necessarily, but by the culture that you live in. All right. The next category is adversive racism. It's another way that we rationalize our racist undercurrent, the big part of the iceberg under the water. I have lots of friends of color. I've got several black friends. I judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Rationalizing racial segregation leads to us understanding that, hey, where does my child go to one of the good schools? Because we know that there are other schools that are not. And we implicitly, we know that in our core, in our being, in our subconscious. And the challenge she's challenging us to make is, why is that? Why are there not all schools good, all schools equal? Well, because some of them have a huge majority of black, of people of color in those schools. And we'll move on to that. We use racially coded terms. We would prefer to use the word urban, underprivileged areas. Those areas are much more diverse, or they're sketchy, or they're not in good neighborhoods. And I mentioned to you before, I was warned where to buy a house when I moved to Augusta, that I was to get into Columbia County and be careful of where I was to buy a place, because some neighborhoods were sketchy or diverse, or urban in nature. And those were code words for meaning that they had a racial mix, and they might have a majority of people of color in them. We proclaim how diverse our community or our workspace is. And I challenge you, take an honest look around. Look around, remember our congregation, remember, and you got to understand tokenism does not count. If you have a few, it's the question is it 50-50 or is it 60-40? Where are we looking here when we think about the people that live around us? We attribute inequality between whites and people of color, the where we live, the schools we go to and attend, to causes other than racism. And to do that, we begin to push upon people of color this idea of sketchy, criminal, violent by means of choice, those kinds of concepts. She gives a wonderful example of friends who bought a really cheap home in New Orleans, but they hadn't done their research. They got there and discovered, well, why was the house $25,000 cheaper? Was because it was in a diverse area, in a sketchy neighborhood. And so she bemoaned the fact that her dear friends had to buy a gun and did not feel safe in the neighborhood. And it had a lot to do with the iceberg underneath the water, that they were working with those unconscious and subconscious racist ideas that were living in them. And so she asked her friend, she said, you said you had friends that bought a house for only 25, I think it was they bought the house for 25,000. It was a steal. And she said, yeah, it was down in New Orleans. And she said, but now they got to have a gun to protect themselves. I wouldn't give you 5 cents for that neighborhood. So she asked her friend, well, I'm assuming you mean that it's a black neighborhood. And she says, yes, you get what you pay for. I'd rather pay $500,000 and live somewhere where I wasn't afraid. Now, I wasn't asking because I want to live there. I'm writing this in a book called White Fragility and How White People Talk About Race. Well, there was immediate defensiveness from her that she would be accused of using coded language to speak about racism. Holding deep racial disdain that surfaces in daily discourse is something that happens to us. Not being able to admit it because then that would conflict with our self-image. I'm not a racist. Are you anti-racist though? Are you deliberately working to change the culture around us and to change to get rid of, to dissolve the iceberg underneath the water? So it functions racially, these discourses that we have in our conversations. It reinforces our fundamental beliefs about people of color, positioning African Americans down into the lowest level of the racial hierarchy that exists. And they've done research, and there are studies, and you know, plenty of people work very hard to discount those studies. Let's see. We reinforce the boundaries between us and them, and that's one of the great faults in our human culture, our human condition that we find ourselves in. White spaces are sheltered, and those who are raised in them are racially innocent. We say those things, and that automatically projects a narrative that people of color are not innocent, are not pure in their motives, are inherently criminal. People of color, blacks in particular, are dangerous. That's the iceberg under the water. So adversive racism only ends up protecting our racial undercurrent, because we really can't challenge our racial filters if we can't consider the possibility even that we have them. And finally, cultural racism. Research is showing us that it's not going to go away with the next generation. Children and race demonstrate that white children have developed a sense of white superiority as early as preschool. It's in the water that we drink, the air that we breathe. There was a great thinking in these last decades, especially when Barack Obama was elected president, that we are now post-racial. And we thought that all of that had gone away. And I frankly was in that boat. I was thinking, boy, this is a whole new idea. I remember one comedian who talked a lot about race, and I enjoyed his comedy. He can't do it anymore, not in today's world, in today's climate. But he was one of those who said, hey, from now on, if anybody accused me of being racist, I'm going to pull out a picture of Barack Obama and say, huh, we're post-racial now. That's the argument, and I resonated with that. So blatantly racist comments and actions are only lived out in certain spaces. And so one example is a story where it's just the white guys around, the frat parties where we tend to be much more misogynist. The white social groups inside the gated community or at the country club or one of these places. And so it says, I sit in a room with a bunch of guys and Phil starts chanting using code words for the N word. And people are laughing. Robbie's there telling a joke, it says, and he glanced around to see if anybody that would be offended by it, anyone of color was around. And then he starts. A black man, a Latin man, and a white guy find a magical lamp on the beach, and then he tells a racist joke. I remember being in the presence of this kind of situation and how awkward that was. I thought it was pretty funny, this person says, and I wasn't the only one. But I'm glad he waited until no one was around to tell it. If you didn't know Robbie, you might misunderstand him. But he's a good guy. He's not racist. If someone's a good person, then they can't be racist. And she counters that. And she says, no, this is called Backstage. In an all-white company. In Backstage, we kind of let our guard down. Our PC police are gone, so we can do what we want to do. And then it starts coming out. And this is the nature of our being. This does not damn us to hell. It doesn't make us not Christian. It just makes us human. This is who we are. But we want to not stay what we are. I always love the fact that God saved me, a worm as I, a sinner, a blind person, gave me sight, and then expects me to move forward towards sanctification. And this is what this is all about to me, our willingness to move forward. So all dissenters are subjected, all of us, to a form of peer pressure in which they were told it was only a joke and we should lighten up. That's not what we're called to. That's not the higher calling of Jesus Christ, to just let it go on. Whether it be misogynist or whether it be racist, we are not supposed to let it go on. It's not enough to just say, I'm going to treat you nice, now you treat me nice. We have to think about the greater culture in which people are being raised. So, it says racially conscious behaviors, including the following. These are white students. Displayed acting overly nice, avoiding contact, crossing the street, not going to that particular bar or club, not engaging more, and being actually afraid to engage cultures where they were the minority in those situations. I know how that'd make me feel. Mimicking black mannerisms and speech as funny. You've seen the problems with blackface, and you wonder how. I had a person in a production I was working with, and he loved to tell the stories of him being in the what was it? Not a mime troupe, but a minstrel shows. And he was talking about it, and I said, "Brother, you can't talk about that as if that was okay anymore." And he was shocked about that. Well, it was wrong. Being careful, of course, not to use racial terms or labels. but we use code words to talk negatively about people of color. And then, of course, there's the occasional violence directed at people of color. And even if it's done, we relegate all of that to the police. We have to be sensitive and understand we are in this situation now because we watched on television a white man having the life choked out of him by a white police officer with his knee on his neck. And it doesn't George Floyd's faults and his foibles and even his criminal background, any of that does not discount the fact that he did not deserve to die by being choked to death on a public street. So if you think the younger generation is no less racist, she says, don't think that way. It's never going to go away, and it's only going to get better if we see the iceberg underneath the water. It's not just the tip of it. It's the iceberg beneath that we have to deal with. God have mercy on us, and let us be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Amen.